like, and make sure to engage in comments and share this video to your friends and story lovers, and click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Inquisco for more real and true stories like this. I never expected to feel this way about him. It started as something innocent, just conversations, just moments where he listened in a way my husband never did. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just venting, that he was just being kind. But the more I let my guard down, the more dangerous it became. I was already struggling with my marriage. My husband, Ethan, had become distant, buried in his work, his phone, anything but me. It wasn't like we fought. There was nothing dramatic, no explosive arguments or cruel words. It was worse than that. It was silence, a slow, creeping distance that made me feel invisible in my own home. I'd lie next to him in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering when we had stopped seeing each other. And then there was his father, Richard. Richard was nothing like Ethan. He was older, obviously, but there was something about him, something steady, something certain. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, the kind that came with experience, with years of knowing exactly who he was. When he spoke, people listened. When he looked at you, really looked at you, it felt like he saw everything. It started with small things, a compliment here, a knowing glance there. He noticed when I changed my hair. He asked about my day and actually listened. And when I laughed at his jokes, he looked at me in a way that made my stomach tighten. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was just desperate for attention, that I was reading too much into things. But deep down, I knew better. There was something unspoken between us, something neither of us wanted to name. One night, Ethan and I hosted a family dinner. It was one of those nights where I felt like a ghost, floating through conversations, smiling when necessary, but feeling miles away from everyone. Ethan barely acknowledged me. He barely looked at me, and Richard noticed. Later, when I was cleaning up in the kitchen, Richard walked in. "You did a great job tonight," he said, leaning against the counter. "Thanks," I murmured, scrubbing a plate harder than necessary. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Are you okay?" That simple question almost broke me. I hadn't been okay for a long time, and no one had asked. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded, but he wasn't fooled. "You deserve to be seen," he said softly. I turned to him, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was charged, heavy with something dangerous. His eyes held mine, and I knew if I took one step closer, everything would change. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it. I should have walked away. I should have laughed it off, made some excuse, anything to put space between us. But I didn't. I stood there, dishwater dripping from my fingertips, heart pounding in my chest, trapped in the weight of his gaze. Richard didn't move. He didn't have to. He just stood there, watching me, waiting, not pushing, not rushing, just waiting for me to decide what would happen next. And the terrifying part? I didn't know what I wanted. The tension in the air was suffocating. I could hear the faint murmur of voices from the dining room, the clink of glasses, the sound of Ethan laughing at something someone said. My husband was just a room away, completely unaware of the way his father was looking at me, completely unaware of how badly I needed to feel something, anything, after months of emptiness. Richard exhaled slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know this isn't right." I did. But I didn't move. His fingers brushed against the counter, so close to mine that I felt the warmth of his skin, without him even touching me. It was like a silent dare, a question hanging between us, unspoken but deafening. I swallowed hard. Then why aren't you leaving? Something flickered in his eyes, something dark and unreadable. I don't know, he admitted. I should. He still didn't move, neither did I. The moment stretched between us, impossibly long, impossibly dangerous. I could feel the pull, the weight of everything we weren't saying. My breath was shallow, my body tense, every nerve screaming at me to step away. And yet my feet stayed planted firmly in place. Then the sound of footsteps. I snapped back to reality just as Richard turned away, reaching for a glass of water as if nothing had happened. Ethan walked into the kitchen, oblivious, running a hand through his hair. Hey, babe, have you seen my phone? It took me a second to find my voice. I think it's in the living room. He gave me a quick peck on the cheek, barely even looking at me. Thanks. And just like that, he was gone. Richard set the glass down with deliberate slowness. When he looked at me again, something in his expression had shifted, like he knew a secret neither of us was ready to say out loud. Good night, Claire, he said, voice low, before turning and walking away. I stood there long after he was gone, my hands gripping the edge of the sink, my breath shaky. That night, I barely slept. I lay next to Ethan, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I kept replaying that moment in the kitchen, the way Richard had looked at me, the way I had looked back. My skin was still burning from the almost touch, the what if that refused to leave me alone. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment, a mistake. It wouldn't happen again. I was wrong. The next morning, Ethan left early for work, barely mumbling a goodbye before walking out the door. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee, feeling that familiar emptiness settle in my chest. Then my phone buzzed. Richard, are you free today? I shouldn't have answered. I should have deleted the message and pretended I never saw it. Instead, my fingers moved before I could stop them. Me, yes. Richard, come over. My hands trembled as I set my phone down. My heart was hammering so loudly, I was sure I could hear it. I knew what this was. Maybe not in words, maybe not yet, but I knew. And I still grabbed my keys. I drove to his house in silence, my fingers gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The entire way there, my mind screamed at me to turn around, to stop this before it was too late. But my body kept moving forward, as if I had no control at all. By the time I reached his driveway, my pulse was racing. His car was there. He was waiting for me. I sat in my car for what felt like an eternity, hands shaking, stomach twisting itself into knots. I could still leave. I could still stop this before it went any further. But then the front door opened. Richard stepped outside, his gaze locking onto mine, unreadable, intense. I should have left. Instead, I opened the car door. I stepped out of the car, my legs unsteady, my breath shallow. The morning air was cool, but I felt flushed, burning from the inside out. Richard stood there on the porch, one hand resting against the door frame, watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what was about to happen, but I knew that once I stepped through that door, there would be no coming back from it. Claire, he said, his voice low, controlled. I swallowed hard. I shouldn't be here. A slow hell. I know. And yet, neither of us moved. The tension between us was suffocating. He wasn't touching me, wasn't even close enough to, but I felt him everywhere. In the way he looked at me, in the way the space between us crackled with something heavy, something dangerous. Come inside, he said finally. A statement, not a request. I should have turned around. I should have gotten back into my car and driven home, pretended this never happened. Instead, I walked past him, stepping over the threshold. The door clicked shut behind me. His house smelled like him. Cologne, wood, something deeper, something warm. It was eerily quiet. Too quiet, except for the sound of my own breathing. I turned to face him, and that was a mistake. Because the second our eyes met, I felt it all over again. That pull, that impossible aching gravity drawing me toward him. He took a step forward. I took a step back. Another step. Another. Until my back hit the wall, and he was right in front of me. So close I could feel the heat radiating off him. I couldn't breathe. His eyes traced over my face, lingering on my lips. I saw his hands clench at his sides, like he was fighting every instinct screaming at him to close the distance. "This is wrong," he murmured. But he didn't step away. I know. My voice was barely a whisper. For a moment I thought he was going to kiss me. I thought I was going to let him. I thought... A sound. The unmistakable chime of a phone buzzing from the counter. We both froze. Richard turned his head slightly, his jaw tightening. I swallowed hard and glanced past him, my stomach dropping when I saw the screen. Ethan. My husband's name was flashing across the display. Over and over, relentless. My pulse thundered in my ears. I felt dizzy, like the room was tilting beneath my feet. Richard stepped back, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something dark, something torn. The phone stopped ringing. A second later it buzzed again, this time a text. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My body was still pressed against the wall, my hands trembling as I forced myself to look down at the message. Ethan. I know. The air in the room vanished. My stomach dropped to the floor, cold dread washing over me in a sickening wave. I looked up at Richard, my throat dry, my entire body frozen in place. He was staring at me, his own face pale, his lips parting like he wanted to say something. Another buzz, another message. Ethan, don't move. I'm on my way. I felt the blood drain from my face. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I had walked straight into a trap, and now there was no way out. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Inquisco for more real and true stories like this.